My grandfather came from Yazoo County, Mississippi to Seattle in 1888. He was approximately 19 years old when he came up here. And so I don't know all the reasons why he left, but certainly one of them was the fact that it was at the end of Reconstruction period, and so there was a lot of overt racism that was taking place in the South, and I'm sure he wanted to get away from that part of the country to an area where he thought there were more responsibilities and opportunities, I should say. He worked for a fellow by the name of Dr. Gannick, who became the first coroner of King County. And so he was kind of a coachman, a valet, for that doctor's family. And then he went on and became a barber. He worked for the federal court. He became a bailiff and worked his way up to becoming a librarian, the court librarian for the federal court here. Pretty much all self-taught because he didn't have that much education, so he went to school on his own, a business college and that sort of thing, to get the knowledge that he needed to be able to be in those kinds of jobs. And so he stayed in that position within the federal court as a bailiff as well as a court librarian up until 1954. When he passed away, I was approximately 12 years old or so. So I didn't get to know him real well because there's so many children in the family. And I remember one time my mother wanted me to say hello to him at Christmas time, and I went up to him with all the children, all the grandchildren and cousins and nephews and so on. I walked up to say hello to Grandpa, and he said, "Now, whose boy are you?" I always remember that because there were so many of us. But I was a little bit indignant. I thought he should know who I was. But fundamentally he was a good man, and he was kind of the patriarch of the family, in essence, of the Gayton families. His name was John T. Gayton. There weren't that many African American families in the Seattle area when my grandfather came here. I think the biggest influx of African Americans coming to Seattle really took place right at the beginning of World War II, and people came to work at the Bremerton shipyards and to work for the Boeing company. So that's when the largest influx in numbers as well as proportionally of African Americans came into this area. My mother went to Howard University. She was raised part of her life. She was born in Spokane and raised part of her life in Vancouver, British Columbia. And so she went off to from British Columbia to Howard University in Washington, D.C. in about 1920 or so. So she completed 3 years at Howard University and then came back to Vancouver. But she had a college education. But my father, who worked in the post office and a variety of other jobs, but for the most part worked for the U.S. Post Office, as did she. He did not have a college education. He finished up at Franklin High School. But my sister, Gula Gayton Johnson, she began to work at the university in about 1950 in the library system there. But the first college graduate from the University of Washington was my brother Gary. But a number of others of us went on to the university, obviously. But then I followed my brother out there to the university. And then my brother John graduated about 1958, my oldest brother. And Gary graduated in 1955, and I graduated in 1960. So that was the transition in relation to our connection with the University of Washington in those undergraduate years. I was recruited by a legendary coach, a fellow by the name of Darrell Royal. I had a fairly successful few years at Garfield High School, and was an all-state football player and all this sort of business. So Darrell Royal, who was the coach out there at the time, felt as though that I might be able to offer something to the program at the University of Washington. And he was there just, I think, about a year and a half. And then after that, Jim Owens came in, and so I played the remainder of my years, my sophomore, junior, and senior years under Jim Owens. But the thing is, it was interesting, there were very few blacks that were on campus at that time. In fact, I would say the largest proportion of blacks were involved in athletics, a number of football players. So there was not a critical mass at all of African Americans at the University of Washington back in the middle and late 1950s. I graduated in 1960 for my undergraduate degree. The interesting thing was, as it related to the football team, I think was important. The largest number of first level or first string African Americans that ever played in the Rose Bowl, we played in the 1960 Rose Bowl, was four. There were four of us, and it's kind of hard to believe nowadays that that was regarded as a significant number. And when you look at the numbers of African Americans that are playing a whole variety of sports at the university now, but that was, up to that time, that was the largest number of first level African Americans to play in the Rose Bowl. And the African American communities throughout the country were really impressed and proud of the fact that there was that large a number of blacks that played in the Rose Bowl at that time. They really didn't think seriously about blacks playing in certain positions. Quarterback certainly was one. There weren't that many blacks who played on the offensive line, and I think there was an assumption about the supposedly brain power or whatever to be able to be in those kinds of roles because they tended to be a little bit more sophisticated. I don't really I really don't know exactly what the concern was, but certainly Warren Moon was the person that changed all that at the University of Washington, and I think a number of other schools throughout the country began to understand that, hey, there can be an African American who can do an outstanding job at quarterback, because that was regarded as elite position. That was the leader. That was the individual who had was usually the brightest person, who knew all about the offense, the intricacies of it, and so on and so forth. So Warren Moon was the one, I think, when you look at the history of University of Washington football, that kind of broke the mold in that regard, and changed the whole direction of how people began to view African Americans in important roles on the football team. And I think that's a major tribute to Don James, who was the coach at that time. Was getting a lot of pressure. I think the first year or so that Warren was playing ball, he wasn't doing all that folks had expected, and I think there was more pressure for him to do better because he was the first African American to be a first string quarterback at the University of Washington. And so there's a lot of pressure on Don James to move him down a few notches on the team, but he stuck with him, knowing full well that he had the capability to become a great quarterback, and the rest is history in that regard. Now he's in the NFL Hall of Fame. I played safety and wing back in those days. We had a kind of a wing T. And so back in those days, the ball players played both ways. We played both offense and defense. So we had much smaller numbers of individuals on the team. There's only about 44, 45 individuals on the team. Now there's way over 100 that are on teams now, because they have the platoon ball, offense and defense. But in order to make the team, you had to be better on defense than you were on offense, and so there were a lot of really good offensive players that it kind of fell by the wayside back in those days, because that's at least how they ran the program when Jim Owens was there. After I received my my history degree with my minor in English, I decided to get my teaching certificate, and so I took care of that, and then about a year or so after I graduated, I started teaching at Garfield High School. So I really didn't do any graduate work that much. I took a few courses, beyond my bachelor's, but I taught English courses and U.S. history courses, and coached a bit of football at Garfield High School. But I also was one of the first African American graduate assistant coaches. I coached when I was doing when I was finishing my teaching certificate. I was coaching one of the 4 graduate assistant coaches at the University of Washington. So that was one of the first. I didn't really think about it at that time as being one of the, if not the first, one of the first to coach at that level as an African American. I had gone on, after I taught at Garfield and coached at Garfield, I went on and I was recruited by the Justice Department. I was recruited to work as as an agent. I was the first African American special agent for the FBI to come out of the state of Washington. So there was a cadre of about 12 to 15 of us. And so I was stationed in places like Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia and Kansas City. And then I stayed in for about 4 years, and I was recruited away to work at Lockheed Missiles and Space Company as what they called as kind of a special assistant in what they called special programs. These were top secret programs working for the Lockheed Missiles and Space Company. And so I did that for about a year. And so while I was down there, I read stories about what was taking place at the University of Washington with some of the difficulties in the athletic department as it related to black athletes, as well as the student issues and so on. So that I was kind of looking at that, from a distance. But then I was contacted by the Black Alumni Association, a fellow by the name of Joe Jones, as well as Joe Kearney, to find out, whether or not I'd be interested in coming in as a football coach, as a full-time assistant football coach. And so that's when I was first contacted with regard to that. And so I had a good job, making good money down in the Bay Area at that time. Yeah. And so I had to do a lot of deep thinking and conversing with my family to determine whether or not I was going to do that. So that's how I was first contacted in relation to the football job that I eventually took at the University of Washington. They gave me a number of different titles. I not only was the assistant football coach, the first full-time black football coach to be hired at the University of Washington, and one of the first on the entire coast, and one of the first in the country for a major, northern university, or any university in the country. But I also was assistant track coach. I also was a counselor. I also was special assistant to the vice president for university relations, and so that was that in essence was the package when I came up. So I had all these jobs. So I was working both the lower campus and upper campus and jobs, and usually it was during the summer. It was during the summertime that I worked in the upper campus jobs, but I still had those roles. So I was an affirmative action package. Because people could see in the rollout of statistics, about all the different jobs. So I had a portion of a whole variety of jobs, and so it probably looked like there was a larger number of African Americans on the University of Washington campus than there actually was. The difficulties with regard to the athletic department and the conflicts among the African American ball players and the coaches had been going on for several years, and I was unaware because I wasn't really in town. Sometimes I get bits and pieces, but I was living back on the East Coast and down in the Bay Area. But I knew Coach Owens. Had a wonderful. I felt a wonderful experience in the Rose Bowl team that I was involved in. In fact, it was the first University of Washington team to win a Rose Bowl. I mean, you can figure all the years that Washington had been playing ball, maybe about 100 years. That was the very first team to win the Rose Bowl, and so that was a very special team. So I felt that I had a special relationship, with the program, particularly with those players, as well as the coaches. And so when I was contacted by Joe Jones and by Joe Kearney, who was the athletic director, I did think about it seriously, but did ultimately decide to take it. But as I understand it, hiring of a black coach was one of the agreements, evidently, between those who are raising issues concerning what was taking place in the athletic department and Jim Owens and the athletic department. At that time, I think Jim Owens was just began to switch as he was both coach as well, head coach as well as athletic director, and I think there was a transition there in that first year where he relinquished the athletic director position and just took on the head football coach position. But what had happened that first year in 1968, things moved along fairly well. We recruited more black athletes, more black football players than we ever had in the history of the school. And we're going into areas that we had not gone into before in terms of recruiting, like San Francisco, as an example, was my area of recruitment. And so we brought in a lot of players that the coaching staff really had not focused on, the inner city of San Francisco, for example. And so we had a lot of African American ball players who came into the program at that time. And the first year, even though we really didn't have that successful of a team, I think may have just won a couple of games. The future looked pretty good. I thought, with regard to the program, we were moving in a positive direction. But the beginning of the '69 season is we ran into difficulty. We got back into the same kind of win-loss situation, and so tensions were high. Whenever you're in a losing program, it's there are concerns, things that you ordinarily wouldn't look at if you're winning. They became issues when you start to lose. And so the ball players were, some of the black ball players became very concerned about how they were being treated. I saw myself as, kind of a mediator. I came there primarily, as I indicated to everybody, to the public, to the players, and to the coaches, that I was there to look out for the best interests of the African American ball players, to make sure that they were going to be treated fairly, and so on. The upshot of the whole thing was that the players were concerned about the direction of the program and whether or not they were going to hang in, and related the concerns to the coach. To Jim Owens. What happened subsequent to that was the coach, everybody's, I think, sensitivity was high. I think everybody felt the tension, both the players as well as the coaches. And I think from my point of view, I thought that the leadership of the whole situation was dependent upon the coaches and how they were going to deal with the situation. I indicated the concerns to the coaches. I thought was my responsibility. The coach felt, after I related these concerns, he felt as though it was time to really come down on the players. I thought that the coach had been moving in proper direction up to that point, but I think that the judgment that was made, and that was to interview every one of the 100 or so ball players to determine whether or not they were loyal to the program, loyal to him, loyal to the university. Black and white players. At the end of those interviews, the coach decided to release 4 players, and they were all black. They were all African Americans, after listening to them all. And quite frankly, the tension and the concerns about the direction of the program were throughout the entire team. And there wasn't any one particular group, but certainly the expressions were voiced by some of the black ball players. I felt as though the direction in which that whole thing went, and that subsequently to these releases of the ball players, I didn't feel as though that I was brought into the loop the way that I should have been. And so I decided to stick up for the ball players. And there was a game that was coming up that weekend. We're going down to UCLA, and the players, they in essence said that they were supportive of the 4 players that were released. And these kids that were released, they were leaders on the team. They were bright, articulate guys. In essence, I don't think they should have been regarded as rabble-rousers or anything of that sort. But they were articulate and voiced their opinions. Well, the black players decided, that they were not going to go down to the game as a result of what happened to those players. And so I decided to stay with them also, and so I remained at home with those ball players. And as the whole situation progressed, again, I was not brought into the discussions. My brother happened to be, he's an attorney, and so a couple of the players went to him, for support and legal advice and so on. And so as the whole thing transpired, I felt as though that it was best for the program, for me to take a position on this and expressed my concern. So I made a press release indicating that I was not pleased with the direction in which the coach had gone, and that I thought there was a better way in which that whole thing could have been resolved, and that I was going to resign from the team. Ultimately, I was hired on as the first affirmative action director for the university, and so that was I took on that position in the winter, January to be specific, of 1970. So I moved on to upper campus. Should be mentioned that I was offered the position of assistant athletic director. I probably would have been one of the first assistant athletic directors in the country, black, and but I refused because I just felt as though that it was best for me to move away from the athletic department and to not only for my personal reasons, but for in essence to make a statement in terms of how I felt about how this whole thing transpired. It should be pointed out that when I did leave, I told the players, and which was true, and I still maintain contact with those young men, and all four of those players have gone on and done wonderful things. One is an actor down in an actor and a director down in Denver, Colorado. Another one is a top executive for the Casey family foundation, and was an assistant athletic director at the University of Washington. Another of those fellows is an attorney here in Seattle. Another one has a master's in urban studies out of the School of Urban Planning, I should say, and moved on and became a minister. In fact, he's a minister, one of the ministers that they have for the football program. He's been in that position for quite some time. So we're not talking about fly-by-night young people. These are bright, focused, articulate men who have, in spite of what happened to them back in 1969, they went on and did wonderful things with their lives. And I'm very proud of that. You had what they call Executive Order 11246, which is called the affirmative action executive order on the federal level, and so it impacted on all universities and colleges that had receiving federal grants. So that meant that the University of Washington, had to have an affirmative action program. We were one of the first public universities in the country to have an affirmative action policy and plan, primarily a policy back in those days. So I initiated that. That was my job as director, and I was one of the the top 2 or 3 African American executives at the University of Washington at that time. And so my primary focus was on establishing policy to increase the representation of African Americans in staff as well as faculty positions. So I had to work very closely with the academic departments and with the personnel department, for that focus. Where you had EOP, the Minority Affairs program, that was on affirmative action programs for, in essence, for students. And so. And I think it was, after that time, I think it was in 1960 that 1970 that Sam Kelly, came in as the first vice president, African American vice president at the University of Washington. affirmative action was a brand new term, and people really didn't have faculty in particular, faculty and staff really didn't have a good grasp of what it really meant. And that was probably one of my jobs too, is to ensure that they had a better understanding of it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 really zeroed in on color blindness. In other words, we're not going to discriminate, based on race, color, creed, national origin, and that color, should not be a factor or a consideration. The difference with affirmative action was that we were going to zero in on color. I mean, we were going to make a determination, what is the makeup of African Americans at the university, Hispanics, Asians, and the various affected groups. And what were we going to do, assuming that there was, not the visibility, and certainly that was the case for the most part across the board in both faculty and staff positions, what kinds of programs, initiatives we were going to have to meet targets, to increase the numbers. And so this was something that was it was different than what the Civil Rights Act tended to focus on, color blindness. With this one, you really did zero in on the numbers. And some people, I think the faculty in my first experience had difficulty, with that concept. They felt as though that, race should not be, brought into the, should not be brought into the picture. And there was an assumption that it was, we're zeroing in on specific numbers of individuals in various categories that we're trying to recruit folks into. But the idea always related to goals, not to look at, a set number of folks in any of those categories, but, what should be the goals? And I think one of the problems we had was getting that information across, that we weren't looking at specific target numbers. We were looking at what is a number that we generally can be able to reach with a good faith effort, and to be able to increase the pools of folks that we would derive the numbers of people that would go into these various jobs. That was what the thrust was. I mean, for example, when we started gathering this data on race, throughout the university, initially there was a great deal of pushback, not to have any of that data at all, because of this colorblind, kind of a concept, and that was a real difficult job that I had, particularly as related to faculty, and I think there was, I can't say that this was the case across the board, but there was a feeling of being indignant about even asking, some folks, are you, what efforts are you making, to make sure that you have we didn't use the term that much, but a diverse pool of people, within the various departments or within colleges. And they said, they became indignant and said, I'm a good person, I'm a faculty member, I'm in a liberal educational institution, and I'm all in favor of that sort of thing. But I kind of think that back in those days, and to some degree even now, that there was theoretically people bought in on the concept, but when it came right down to making it happen, getting the numbers in to the departments and so on, it was a very difficult row to hoe. So there was a lot of learning that needed to take place, and understanding what the problems were in order to be able to make progress. And I think that considering where we are now and where we were then, I think we made fairly good progress back in those days, but certainly not at the levels that we should. But that we should have. But I think we established a base. But it took an awful lot of work, and I don't think we're is beyond where we were back in the 1970s, where we are now. I don't think we are where we should be. There's no question about that. With regard to I-200, I think there was a lot of scare tactics involved. People were saying that these were quota programs and that we wanted specific numbers. And just to reiterate what I just mentioned earlier, and that is that affirmative action never was a quota program. It always was related to good faith efforts. It always related to goals. I think that we, still fall within, I-200. I don't think it's necessary. I think it's a red herring. But I think even within I-200, from my point of view, that you still can go out and make good faith efforts to be able to increase the pool of folks without zeroing in necessarily on quotas, but to be able to zero in on groups of people who have been restricted from coming to the university, or because of a variety of other factors aren't coming in. I worked for the Boeing company for many years, and one of the things that they pointed out when they made their move to Chicago for their corporate offices that I worked in for a number of years, but not in Chicago, but here in Seattle. And they focused in on diversity as being a major business thrust, a major bottom line business thrust for the company, saying it was good business to have a diverse workforce. If you have the same kinds of individuals and all these variety of jobs see things the same way, they are not going to be creative enough to come up with the wonderful airliners that they have, with the wonderful services they provide, the products they provide. You need varieties of perspectives in order to be able to make the best products and services. So they see it as a bottom line business interest, and I think there are a lot of businesses that see it that way. I think when we first started, affirmative action programs, there was kind of an altruistic kind of thing. This is right and good to be able to do. I don't think people really were able to grasp that the way that we were beginning to see what's happening with regard to the world as a whole. The world is becoming smaller. We're seeing that the great majority of people in the world are people of color. When people of color are buying products, from the United States, for example, there is an interest and concern about talking and working with people who are look like them. I think it becomes much more of a when it becomes more of a practical direction, a business direction. I think that's the kind of thing that people can grasp in a better way, and I think that's the way in which the university, needs to go. I think the Harvards of the world, the University of Washington, they're saying that having a diverse population. So I think this is the difference from what it was back in the 1970s. This is what's going to make us a better university in terms of what we're going to be able to produce. When it comes to outstanding research, when it comes to outstanding students, those are the things that are going to enhance us if we do a better job of that. I've been away from the programs at the University of Washington for quite some time, so I just hear and things from folks and read what I see in the newspapers, and I know that people are still working hard at it. There's no question about the fact that a lot more can be done. But I think the commitments that I've seen from Dr. Emmert, for example, I think those are the kinds of things that he's pushing for, the kinds of things he's putting into place, the scholarship programs and so on. I think those are extremely effective, extremely important. But with regard to the tenured faculty positions, for example, I think that, at least from what I've been able to gather, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in that arena. But certainly the atmosphere is much more. I think people tend to be more open and more understanding of the situation. Whether or not we're making the strides that are necessary to get to where we need to go, I just can't say. But certainly setting the groundwork in those early days. I mean, the mindsets of people were much different then than they are now. It was hard work. I mean, just as an example, when I was talking to the law school, to the head of the law school back in the early 1970s about bringing in more law professors, because there were none back in those early days. There were no African American law professors. And one of the comments that was made, I don't know if it's by the dean or the associate dean, said, well, you know, we sent a letter to Thurgood Marshall, and Thurgood Marshall, refused us. Well, I think at that time Thurgood Marshall, had just been appointed to the Supreme Court. I mean, those are the kinds of things that, I mean, just kind of mind-boggling responses that you got, back in those days. That's one of many where you just didn't, the true commitment in terms of making this whole thing work really was not there. And like I said, I think the mindsets are better, and I certainly hope so. One of the things I was happy to be able to do, though, when I was at the University of Washington, when I was at the Boeing Company, is to be able to set up, provide scholarship programs through the Boeing Company to the university and many other universities throughout the country. And one of the programs I was most supportive of and was proud of was something called the SENSE program, Scholarships for Engineering Students Education, as part of the MESA program, Math, Engineering, Science Achievement. And what we did was be able to set aside monies, for young people from their freshman year all the way through their senior year, and they wouldn't get it until they finished their senior year, and they had counseling along with that. And the Boeing Company was able to put in over $1 million for that kind of thing. And more than the money, I think it was the connection that those young people had with those people who were designated as the mentors and counselors for those young people. And then seeing them, those kids that I helped support with those first grants back in the early 70s, and see them graduate from the university, African American women, for example, and Hispanic women, African American males with Hispanic males with their engineering degree, and then coming on to Boeing. I mean, that's something that really makes you feel as though that these things can work. They will work. There's a long history of people through the EOP program and many other things that shows that those things work if you have committed individuals and if you have the resources behind those programs to ensure that they're gonna work. So there's a lot of hope out there. We just have to do it I think in a broader way, in a way that's going to have a much greater impact on a greater number and segment of the population, particularly those who have been negatively affected by the kinds of circumstances that they've been involved in here in this country. If we want to be competitive as an institution of learning that is going to provide benefits to society as a whole, having a diverse population of faculty, a diverse population of students, that's going to make the university sustain itself, for the 1,000 years that people talk about.